yeah, my name is Lara, and I am a 3D environment and prop artist currently working at Triumph Studios in the Netherlands as an intern. I have been a freelance artist before while I was studying, and yeah, I really like making environments and stylized art. I also do like to work with more realistic projects, as you can see in some of my work here on our station, where you can go to contact me or to look at my projects. And yeah, I like to work with environments with a lot of styles, but especially stylized, and also to concept some stuff because why not? So yeah, I have a big passion for stylized art, and that's why I gather some tips and tricks to share with everyone. My style is constantly evolving as well because I also am still learning and discovering a lot of things. So I hope this can be useful for someone who is starting and wants to grow their skill in stylized art. All right, so I put together a little overview of the workshop. Mainly, we are gonna look at three different softwares: Substance Painter, Substance Designer, and Unreal Engine. That's because these are the three main softwares I use for the creation of stylized materials and textures. Especially in the workshop, I thought about some elements and some things that I always like to have in the materials I am making for my stylized projects. These elements are something like color variation, gradients, and highlights. These things for me are what makes the something stylized, and how you tweak it then depends, but it's the base from which I start from. And so I'm gonna take a look at each one of these topic and look at how I can implement it into each one of this software, and how I can think of color variation with Substance Painter, Substance Designer, and in Unreal Engine. The same for gradients and highlights. And yeah, so it's gonna be a lot of tips and tricks on these elements. First of all, I wanted to talk about stylized materials in general a little bit. Um, for me, there are so many different level of stylization. It really depends on what we want to, the look that we want to achieve. It really depends from how much details we put in, and the level of these details. If something looks more cartoony or more realistic, because these details thrive more further from reality. And that's why I really like to look for reference, not only for just the environment and the props I'm making, but also for the materials and the shapes and the amount of details I want to put into the sculpting. Mm. So yeah, and how much these shapes gets pushed, how much stylization, and how the amount of details, the shape language. There's not really a sort of rule on how things have to look like. That's why I really like stylized art. There's so much freedom on all of these things, and it's open to possibilities. But I believe what makes it consistent is having these details and the style that match with each other, and that in the same project there is a line that connects everything, and it's not all the things are disconnected and with different style or uh, with different quality. So yeah, that's why I try to, every time I have to make a project, not only break down the elements of the project, but also break down how I'm gonna make the textures and the sculpts, and yeah, just planning all these elements from the beginning. As an example, I wanted to show some of the reference I have. Um, so this is some reference bashed together from some other projects. But generally, what I was saying is I collect, of course, more traditional reference for the elements inside my project, but I also try to collect reference that can tell me something about the style I want to go for, something about the work that was already done by other people and what elements I liked about it and how I can implement those elements in my work. I also really like to already try think of how I'm gonna make something in the software itself because it gives me peace of mind, I guess, if I already know I can achieve something. But yeah, so when I think of a prop or whatever, I often try to go look into how it has been done and how I can stylize it and which elements I like and I don't and how I want to achieve those. I do the same things for materials and looking at what is the level and of details and how are the colors, how are the texture, what is the quality of the things I'm making, what elements I want to keep. So I have a reference also for the the details of these materials I'm making. Or for the sculpts, the same thing, how much I want to go into detailing when I'm sculpting. I keep some color boards because I like to think of colors already while I'm texturing, so I know that like my scene needs to look in a certain way. So while I'm texturing, I'm gonna like make things fit to it. And yeah, just trying to get reference for all the elements I have in a project, and so not just general references, but also on the style, on the sculpt, on the materials. But most important for me is breaking down the scene. So, for example, I had this concept, and yeah, I was thinking about modularity and how I could reuse some elements and the models. But for me, the things that I need the most is having a clear plan on how I'm gonna tackle the material and the textures inside a project. So for this one, I divided like the elements between what I wanted to do with substance designer materials, so tiling, textures, and yeah, textures I could generate with substance designer. What I could make with trim sheets, so maybe sculpting the trim sheet in ZBrush and then baking it in Substance Painter. And yeah, so I divided the whole project in this way, and something that felt more overwhelming becomes more doable after I do this because I can be like, okay, it's I can achieve it. Even with projects that are a bit less stylized, I do the same, especially when they have a lot of elements like this one. I was planning not just how to make the props inside the environment and where I could use more modular elements, but also how I was planning the textures and the materials for it. So, for example, where you see all the green is materials that I could reuse. There are tiling materials with tiling textures made in Substance Designer with cement and I don't know, some wall material. Same thing for like the pipes. All the blue pipes could I use a tiling metal texture, and I just pointed out where I wanted to reuse it. Same for these more squarish railing. I reused a metal um, tiling texture with also some trim sheet elements. Yeah, so just trying to point out all the elements that I know are recurrent and how I can summarize the whole scene into these textures and materials so that I know I don't have to make 200 of them, right? And yeah, for me, this is a very important part of the process. I guess everyone has their own. I saw a lot of articles with people doing all of them different pre-production for their work. I find these the most useful for me because I focus a lot on the textures and the materials, and therefore I also know what kind of models I will need based on that. So I find important already thinking about that before I start a project, and I advise it as well. The first topic I wanted to talk about is color variation. As a reminder, I'm gonna run through these topics, like color variation, highlights, and gradients, by showing example with all three of the different softwares I talked about. So Substance Painter, Substance Designer, and Unreal Engine. So yeah, I hope you can follow through. But at any point, you can just stop the video and look at all the other stuff. But it's gonna be a lot of tips and tricks. So color variation. Color variation is for me something I always try to have in the textures I'm making. First of all, because I feel like it gives a sort of more grainy feeling to the textures, which is more realistic. Because I believe that everything in Stylized has still starts from realism, and I think the more it kind of recall it, the more it's also a better stylized element. There's actually no, even if a surface it looks with that it has a flat color, it's probably not in real life. Surface doesn't don't have just one color. So when we are making stylized art, we can push that fact and create interesting effects and maybe some painterly effects. So yeah, so things we see also don't have only one color. And by doing so, by pushing that element, pushing the color variation, we can add depth and texture to a material and make some very cool and interesting effect and make it look just less flat. And as first example, I wanted to show some things I've done in Substance Painter. So these are some small props I did in Substance Painter for a personal project, which was the Art Station Challenge, I think, actually. So yeah, some small, simple props, nothing too crazy. But for me, color variation is like the base from which I start building upon a material. And stylized materials are just like a series of levels and building up towards the final output. But the base, at the at the base, I always need something that has some texture to it, some color variation, so that it gives in the end a more realistic feeling. And it is something that can be quite simple, or it can be also more elaborated and with more effects. It kind of depends, but for props that were quite small like this, I kept it very simple. And I wanted to show some tricks inside Substance Painter with this. So, for example, I had this little energy box or something. And this is something I do with almost everything, is just giving a layer of uh, texture that changes the base color. So let me find it. All right. So generally, I just have a base color with a texture that is overlaid on top, and which also changes the roughness so that it matches with the changes in the color, in the base color. And this is for me the base to just start from. It already gives a lot of realism to the prop and a lot of grainy feeling and uh, yeah, just more detail. And this is quite simple, just with a texture on top of it. But sometimes I wanna go a bit more um, in the detailing of something. So I have another example, which is the bench. Generally, I like having a painterly feeling to everything I do in stylized art. And there's some tricks I use for it. Let me turn this off. All right, so this is what I consider for myself the base for starting the actual material and textures, which is a base color with discoloration in some areas and color variations are going on around. And from this, I build upon with other generators for curvatures and cavities and ambient occlusions and uh, whatever else. So how I do this usually is just starting with a base color, and then I use generators to achieve some discoloration based on some areas of the prop itself. So in this case, I wanted to have a color variation that was centered uh, on the top of the prop here. So I used some generators that was taking uh, like just the center. And then I use my favorite filter, which is Blur Slope. And with Blur Slope, I always make things being quite smudgy and painterly, and it's quite nice. I always like to use it for almost everything. And with changing the intensity, I can make it more smudged or less. And I can also change the tiling so that I can have it more like if I would see the brush strokes, let's say it, or less and more soft. So I always try to mix it also with the blur, and then I can also lower it from here if I don't want it everywhere. But yeah, this is quite an important uh, part for me to just like give a smudgy feeling to this type of elements. And then I keep building on it by adding color variation on the edges, for example, with the same technique. So having a generator uh, that takes the edges and then smudging it with the blur slope. And I already have this sort of painterly effect everywhere. Something else is using a texture instead of a generator, and then again using blur slope to change it. So this is how it looked like without. It was just a texture of wood, and then with blur slope, I make it more stylized and more painterly to match the vibe. And yeah, this is my base to start upon, and then putting all the rest of the things on it. And this is something I do everywhere, even in metallic elements or other small elements. I always try to have this painterly effect with smudge and blur slope everywhere. And I feel like this is a way to keep the consistency into the props that I am making and in their base color. I think even for the soap I used like a wooden texture and then I used the blur slope and then it created this sort of texture on it. While with another program like Substance Designer, I also try to reach a point where I have a base texture to start from, something like this, that has some color variation in it and some painterly filling already. And then I keep building the material on it but this is like a good base to start from for me. And how do I reach this is mainly by with two elements that are important. So first of all, I of course make the base for my bricks, right? In this case, um, and you end up with something like this from Word, and you also keep adding details and whatsoever. But generally, we can get uh, to start this. I need a random grayscale texture like this one that I can use to recolor my texture and give different values. And I usually obtain this from the threshold, flood fill to random grayscale, and distance. So from this, I can connect my gradient map and assign some different color here, right? I can just assign whatever color I want. And I'm gonna create a texture, a color texture based on the grayscale version. So if I just change the random seed of this, it's also gonna give me different. Oops, I'm sorry, not this. This one. So if I change different random seed in here, it's also gonna give me different combination if I'm not happy with what I achieved. So yeah, this is my gradient map. And nothing. This is one of the element I use to start coloring my base texture. And this way I can already put into the texture a lot of different color that are also based on the shape underneath, and it's not just random, right? The second element is having a painterly texture that I can combine together with my gradient map. So generally, you can use any type of noise to create your texture. I use a combination of noises and slope blurs. And again, I recolor it with a gradient map. So I can put some colors based on the noise I'm creating. I also create some painterly texture that looks like brush strokes, and I merge them together, the noise version one and the brush, so that I have this sort of grainy material that I can put together with my gradient map. But something that is also important for me is taking this texture that I just created, and as the gradient map is influenced by the shape of the bricks underneath, I also want this texture to be influenced by it. So I use a directional warp that warps this texture based on the brick shape. So I just connect on the first input the texture, and on the second one is again connected to the random grayscale one. So this one. This way my texture is gonna break and create where the brick shapes ends and start, and it's gonna be different for each of the brick. And then this warp texture and the gradient map get blended together to have a base start for my bricks. This was like a very strong colored bricks. It was for a very stylized wall. Uh, but I can use the same for some more natural toned bricks anyway. Maybe I can show this one. Cool. These are some other type of bricks. And the nice thing is that you can copy this setup and just reuse it everywhere for consistency, right? Even these bricks that are more natural colored and less like flashy and with rainbow colors have the same setup. So the warp texture and the gradient map with some more natural toned colors. I always try to have some cold and some warm ones, and then blend it together to start my texturing. Same for this floor, for example. You can see in the material how each one of these pieces has kind of like a different tone, and that's also achieved in the same way. So with a gradient map, that color picks from the random grayscale. And yeah, I just give it some different colors, some cooler one, some darker one, blend it together with the warp texture. And this is my base to start from. And then of course I add like all the rest of the elements, right? But that's for later. This is what I need to start from usually. The last thing I wanted to show about color variation is with using Unreal Engine. So this is one of my projects done with Unreal. And yeah, I used a lot of color variation tricks here. And I'm gonna show you a little bit. So I of course made the materials in Designer and I made the textures for it. Uh, but then I always try to have in my material a way of adding some differentiation, yeah, some differences between all the different, for example, houses and the different type of walls, and something that makes the texture looks different and add more uniqueness to elements, and just also gives another layer of uh, texture to the elements. So on these houses, I had, besides my base texture, a way of adding another texture that would change the color and create some noise over the surfaces. So let's have multiple instances. So I can control the opacity, that's a bit much, and the tiling of it, and also the color. It's also world aligned, so if I would have different instance of the same model, then it would be different on each one of them. And this is how I added color variations everywhere on every element, and it's also the base for uh, the moss. How I achieve that is in my shader. I have my base texture, and I have a base texture version that is overlaid with another color, which is the color of the tint I want to give. And these two elements, so my base texture and my tinted version, are in a lerp together, where the alpha is given by the texture that gives the grainy feeling. The texture is word aligned, so that is different for all the instances. And since I had a lot of the same house, um, same iteration of the same house, I just wanted it to be different on each one of them, and with a series of parameters to control, for example, the opacity, then it's used as alpha and I have that effect. Something also I do sometimes is actually having I export the ambient occlusion of the material to, let's tone this down, so that I can actually increment the ambient occlusion of the material inside Unreal to have it darker and also change the color so that I also have that control over it. And that is just with an export of my ambient occlusion that is inverted because I need the cavities to be filled and not the opposite, and used in a lerp with another color and my base texture. So this is the main thing I do for changing the base color, and it's something I have everywhere. I have it in the wood, in all the houses. For example, I can show this one as well. I just overlaid this color, and I can change the tiling, and I can create it. I can add uh, more layer to this plaster material. This is also the base for how I made the bricks. So the brick is just another texture, another material, um, and it's controlled by how much we can see of this brick is controlled by a texture that works the same as the color change. So the texture I want to use to be the mask of the brick is put in the world align texture node with some parameter to change the offset or the tiling or the power of the texture, and then used in a lerp between the texture of the house and the texture of the brick for each one of these textures, so the normals, ambient occlusion, all of them. And that's just quite simple how I made the bricks. Something also very cool is that all of these houses, all of these roofs, the beams, they all share the same materials, but just switching colors, which is something that works very modular. So there is a switch setting, and I can change color completely and give okay green or blue, the amount of the intensity, and this is how I create a different version of the same house with different color. Even same for the windows, for example, they're all the same uh, material with different instances that have different color overlaid on top of it. And then I can just choose it. And this is done just, maybe let's show this one. It's better. Yeah, this is done just by having the base color texture overlaid with another tint. And yeah, I just put this in a switch so I can just decide if I want it or not and how much I want it. So this is something I planned before starting, and therefore I knew I didn't have to make all the different materials or all the different houses because I was just gonna reuse the same material in the engine to create the different houses, and this spared me a lot of time in when I was creating the models. So yeah, in that way I found it useful to do it at the beginning. And yeah, this was it for the color variation topic with all the three different softwares. And next up, I have gradients. So the first thing with gradients is they're really cool because they make everything blend better together. But it's also quite important to think about where are we going to use the gradients and where are useful, because not every prop or material or texture might need a gradient. It really depends on the use and the position of the prop. Maybe this prop is gonna rotate a lot and it's gonna be flying. I don't know. It's gonna be in different angles. It's a modular piece. So in that case, is maybe having a gradient is not the best idea because it will be very visible. For example, in a modular kit, if we have some beams, that it would be maybe strange having gradients because then you have gradients going kind of everywhere, while usually you try to keep a gradient going always in the same direction, for example, from the bottom to the top, because that's actually how like things look like because of the light. They are lighter on the top and darker on the bottom. And it's also important to think of where you wanna add the gradient, if it's already in the texture, or maybe sometimes it's better to add it in the engine. For example, in Unreal, it's easy to add a gradient that goes from the whole bottom of the object, instead that having it into the texture itself, that it's harder to control that way. So yeah, it depends. Some element might benefit having a gradient in it, some might not. So it's always something I try to think about. All right, I'm gonna show some gradient tricks done in Substance Painter, first of all. So I'll still check this energy box. So first of all, I do always add a little bit of a gradient in every prop. For example, even in the little ones. Again, it depends on the type of prop, but sometimes I can still have it a little bit everywhere. And generally, I do the most simple way, which is just adding a gradient using the position generator, and then I can oop, exaggerate it, just change it and paint it away. Uh, Sometimes I add it over the edge as a highlight, sometimes under it. In this case, for example, I wanted the edges to be darker as well, where on the bottom, so I just added it on top. Something a bit more complex, for example, this tree. Mm, so I had my base, my color variation, of course, very simple, but still effective. And then I try to have a top gradient that is lighter and warmer, and a bottom gradient that is darker and colder. So top layer done with the position, and I use an extra blur sometimes to like blur it a bit more, and a bottom gradient that it's on the top because I want the edges to be like all these edges that I'm adding, I want them to be influenced by the bottom gradient. So they also get darker at the bottom. And again, just done with an inverted position. Something that is very cool, in my opinion, is something that is very cool, in my opinion, besides this type of gradient, is using a light generator with which we can achieve this type of effect. And with blurs loop, it can give like a very painterly feeling. We can test it together. So if I have a color, oh, yeah, this one is empty. So just a base color with some roughness, and then in my black mask, I just add a generator, light, and this one will simulate the light coming from the direction that I choose. I'll do something like this. Yes. And then by adding a filter and blur slope, I have my light. Blur it. And this is a very quick way to add both color variation and gradients based on the light. And also a very like painted feeling to the prop itself. And yeah, we can like just put all this together in the end. And we have our tree. So this was mainly it for Painter. It's very quick and very obvious, but it's also very important. And of course, I, for example, put gradients in props like this tree or the small props because it's not like this tree is gonna fly around or get upside down generally. So I can also have a very strong gradient and it's gonna look fine. But again, if it's a prop that has to be used modularly and needs to be rotated a lot, then maybe adding a gradient like this in textures is not the best idea. Next up is Substance Painter, uh, Substance Designer. So for Substance Designer and gradients, I don't really do much with gradients in Substance Designer because, of course, I am making trim textures or tiling textures, and yeah, it doesn't really serve a purpose to have gradients in there. But if I have some elements like this part of the trims that are broken apart and can use some height difference and color difference, then I'm gonna use some gradients. For example, I had this little squarish shapes that I filled with a gradient, so they would have different sort of cavities and sides where they are higher and some sides where they are more into this mud. So when I have something like this, I can do a height blend with a texture, and the texture is gonna go and cover those sides that are um, more deep down. And I can also use it to fill this part of the trim and some level and blur it. So I can also add some different color and gradients inside these little elements. But this is one of the few examples I have where I use gradients inside Substance Designer. Sometimes I use Substance Designer to add moss, but I don't do it with a gradient, but I just create a generator. Because if I add moss into the engine, then I have this cool effect of the moss from the bottom. But sometimes I just want the moss in the texture and I do it in the engine, in the in Substance Designer, sorry. I will show the bricks as an example. So these were my bricks. I created a moss pattern, just a waveform that gets through some changes and some different shapes of moss. Put it together in a tile sampler. In here, I place a texture that is gonna get the cracks, the cavities of my bricks, and then invert it. This mask is gonna determine where the moss gets spawned. I also use this mask to blur my texture so that I have a better blending between, this is the blurred part so that I have a better blending between the moss and the bricks. So when I add the moss, it actually is a bit blurred around it. And this, I can show you how it looks like. Color, color. Whoop. Yes. And by changing the cavities here, I can decide how much moss I want. Put more. So yeah, that's not something that works with a gradient, um, but it is something cool we can do in Designer with moss. And now on to Unreal Engine and gradients. So in Unreal Engine, something I do a lot is using gradients to blend the elements with the terrain a bit better. And so everything merged together well, and there's less of a contrast between the different elements. Um, and yeah, it's nice when you have, for example, grass or something like that, and then you can add moss to the elements. What I can do is in my material, I have some settings to, of course, change. Let's change the opacity of this. Let's make it strong so it's visible. And then I have a high offset because this gradient takes the bottom of the object and adds this. Multiplying the moss can change the power of it. The texture, because this gradient is put together with a texture that it removes a bit of it, so it's not a flat gradient, but it always has some texture to it. If I just put down the opacity of the texture, then it's quite flat. I put it up, then I have this grainy effect. And yeah, I just like to have some parameters to change it up. And how this is done, it's so first of all I have a color for my moss, and it's mainly based on two elements. So one is the texture that is gonna get subtracted to the gradient. So it's texture that's world aligned, and it has some values to change it, some parameters, so power and the opacity. And this texture gets subtracted to the gradient. So the gradient takes the bottom position of an object, and with some parameters I can change the offset, so the height, multiply it, I can power it, and then I invert it. So this is how my gradient looks, and then when it is subtracted, it actually looks like this. So it creates like a nice grungy effect. And this becomes just the alpha for the lerp between whatever we want as base and the moss color. And this effect is everywhere and it's very cool because it stays just on the bottom, and it's everywhere on the wood as well, on the roof, on the trees, on every rock. So if I would to take a wall and rotate it, then this gradient stays on the bottom. Oh. Something similar is with the roof. The roof have a gradient from bottom to top as well, but it's also influenced by the height map of the roof so that the moss shows more in between the cracks and it creates like a cool effect. So I have the same parameter as before. I can change the offset of the height of the gradient, multiply it, the power of the moss to more soft. The tiling of the texture, because also here it's subtracted with a texture. You can make it strong or more flat. The difference is that in the material, I didn't put a parameter for it. So in the material, I have the general setting that I used before as well, but this whole setting, the gradient, gets multiplied by the result of this high texture. So I use the high texture inverted because we need the cavities and a height lerp node. And with some values, I can get some positions in the height map. For example, if I change this, it's quite strong, but I can get more of it or less, and I can change the contrast here. And this gets multiplied for the gradient. This way it removes a bit of the moss on the tiles and it puts a bit more into the cavities. And this way the height influences my gradient. So yeah, this is how it works here. It's also used in the bricks. That are around to get that little extra effect of height. Another quick tip to create some sort of mountains with moss on the top that is also influenced by the normals, for example, of the model. I have these values in this material. It's a bit trickery to control this, but it was fine for what I needed to do. I think I actually got this from a tutorial some time ago, but it's cool. I can just change the values of this color and it's gonna kind of shift the direction that it's taking of the faces. But I can create this gradient from the top and yeah, get it influenced by the normals of the model. And how this works is the normal of the like the normal texture of the model gets transformed to world space and it's blended together with the vertex normal, and then I do the dot product with a value. If I put fully blue, it's just from the top, and then yeah, clumped. And this is the alpha for. It's not really visible with this one actually. But yeah, this is used as alpha for my for the lerp between the color of the top and the color of the base. And just by switching that gradient, I can get different direction based on the vertex normal of the prop as well. So this is like how to very quickly create this effect. And yeah, that was it for gradients in Unreal Engine. I use a combination of these tricks kinda everywhere to color, to add textures, even in the tile path here. I used a texture and height blend so that this moss also goes a bit into the cracks, and I did it the same way as the roof. It just doesn't have a gradient, but it's the same. And I can have that. Can you do some stuff? Yes. And it creates a really cool effect. And this is also just a texture, word align texture, and the height blend. Uh, so this moss texture gets applied with a noise texture and a height blend together, used as loop. But yeah, that's the principle of it. Uh, yeah, I hope this is useful. And next up is the last topic, which is the highlights. So highlights are one of the last thing I add to my materials and textures, but it's also one of the prettiest thing to add, I believe, because I feel like it really makes something shine and pop. And you can also just paint some bits of highlights manually. And for someone who likes to do that kind of work, it's really nice. But yeah, so I'm gonna show some stuff in Substance Painter first of all. Let's get my props. It's quite simple, but I always try to have a mix of highlights added with a generator, and I feel like I always have to go and paint some highlights and edges myself because I guess it really depends on the style we're trying to achieve, but I don't feel like with the generator I can get everything I want. And it really gives like a more artistic and painted feeling when I add those sort of edges. I can also just fake it because the generator would never take this little cut probably. So, mm, mm, yes, and here I always have a version done with the generator curvature, and I generally try to take a big edge and then I just add a paint layer where I just paint some more to it and I fake some light coming from the top by adding little edges or just more chips to it. And it's pretty much it everywhere, right? Just adding these little hand painted chips to it. When I have some more bigger and complex props, I can show the tree again. I build up the edges in layers because I don't feel like that with one layer I can achieve the right look. It's too always too strong. So let's turn it off. From my base with my gradients and my light direction like this, I usually, for example, here have three layers for the edges. The first one, it's quite uh, smooth and not too strong, and also quite big on the size of the edge that it's considering, right? And is again done with a generator. And then I have a second one that adds more grunge to it and adds some more light on the edges. And then the third one takes just a little bit of the edge and adds a very lighter color. So the edge is stronger, and I also use blur's loop to smudge it a bit, and I also just painted in some areas where I want it, honestly, because why not? So I build up the edges with a few layers because I don't feel like that with just one I can add all the edges and that's it. But I feel like I have to build it up from like a soft look to something on the top a bit more sharp. And that's mainly it with Substance Painter. I'm gonna show Substance Designer. So for Substance Designer, it works the same principle as Substance Painter. To get the edges usually is the last thing I add when I'm making the color of a texture. To get the edges, I start from the output of the normal map. So when I connect my normal map to my material, right, I take the output. This is something I didn't know before. I'll show it in a bit, but the output of the normal, I make a curvatures mode from the normals, and with the levels, I can decide which area to take of these of my normals, the cavities, the edges. I can just take different areas to add. So these nodes that connect the normal to the curvatures mode i- is just to avoid having spaghetti nodes everywhere. So I can just like drag it out, press Alt, and leave. Just call it a name like cool. I don't know. And then when I need this output, I can just, let's say I need it here, I can drag it from here, press Alt, and then in here, I select connection, cool. And it's just gonna take that node that I just made, but without showing the connection. Anyway, I take the normal, curvatures mode, and with levels, I can just change up and select. For example, here I'm taking the cavities with levels from curvatures mode, and here I am taking the edges. And then I don't really add colors, I just keep changing the base color with a filter like HSL and add it on top. So I again work in layers, one softer where I add from this uh, with a level mask, I add a softer edge. And then with another level mask that's a bit sharper, I add some more edge light and things pops. And that's mainly it. Yes. Of course, if I have something more complex, then I work with more layers and more masks, but that's mainly the general part of it. The last thing is highlights in Unreal Engine. I don't often do this, but sometimes it's quite nice to have this. So I'm gonna show an example in because I didn't do it in this project, but I did it in this one. So for example, in here I had all these buildings that needed the same tiling materials with the cement wall uh, tiling material. But I still wanted that sort of ruined edge filling on the meshes. And so I decided to make an edge mask for these buildings where the base would be a tiling material that I could just tile normally on the base. And then on top, I would have a mask that would add normals and color only to the edges of the model. This was done by using two UV sets. So the first UV set is used for the tiling base texture, and the second UV set is the one that is used for the edge mask. I can show a quick example of it in here. This doesn't really make sense because I made it with the textures I have in here, but still works. So this model has two UV sets. So the two UV set, you can see one is just bigger, not perfect, whatever, and the second one is unwrapped in a different way. And the second one, since I wanted to use it for the edges, is unwrapped on this texture. This is a edge mask, so I'm gonna apply this edge effect only on this, based on this mask here, and also the normals. And how it's set up in the material is that I use this mask with some values as alpha of a loop between either two normals or two colors. The important part is that I change the UV number here from 0 to 1, which is the second UV set, but 0 also counts, so 1 is the second UV set. And yeah, so quite simple, but it's very useful sometimes when we have like bigger elements and we don't want like a huge texture to texture them, but we still want to use styling texture and still have the edges. So I can have a base texture that tiles. Make it even stronger. Can have a base texture that tiles and still have the edges that are untouched and with that effect still there. So I can control it differently and I can have more resolution in some big elements that I need. For example, if I would implement these houses, because now they are quite flat because they don't have normals on the edges, this is what I would do. I would actually unwrap a second UV set of all these elements on something like this to have that effect on the edges. And yeah, that's about it. I had it on every element in the other project, right? So I could tell the metal, so I had some values to like change. It breaks a bit, but we'll change the edges, the opacity, the color. Beautiful. But yeah, it's sometimes it's quite useful to have it like this in the engine. And that was it also for the highlights topic. So that was it for the workshop. Thank you for following till here. I hope this was useful. It's a lot of tricks and tips I use, but it's also I'm also still learning and developing my skills. So I hope this can be useful for someone. And yeah, thank you again for having me and following this workshop.
Thank you so much, Lara D'Adda, for taking your time and sharing this amazing workshop with us. They are only made possible with the support of our lovely Patreon supporters, and I want to thank each and every one of them for making our lovely community a thriving place of learning and growth. If you want to join these artists and level up your own environment art skills, then go to beyondthesum.com, where you can become a member of our community, where we offer weekly work reviews, a 250-page book full of tips, portfolio reviews, and much more. All of the links can be found in the description down below. Stay creative, and I hope to see you there.